This first article, though, I loved reading this. This was just like like a cool breeze on a hot summer day. It's
Wasn't it?
just it's so good. This is what I call intellectual Kevlar. If
Yes.
you read stories like this, this is by our good friend Dr. Andrea Love, who is
The rock
an
star.
immunologist. She's very good at taking really technical concepts and just breaking them down so you understand the substance, right? She doesn't oversimplify it, but she says, here's like, let's start with this, and then we're going
Mhm.
to build on this. And by the end of her work, by the end of a podcast interview or an article she's written, you've actually learned some really important science.
That's right.
And this is, as I just said, clickbait viral headlines claim that chemicals are sending cancer rates soaring. That's not what the science says. Um, I'm going to rely on you heavily, Liza, to break this down. But just as a brief overview, she talks about some major headlines in the New York Times and some other big media outlets that give the impression that cancer rates are skyrocketing. They'll actually use that word, skyrocketing, among younger people. And this is alarming, ostensibly, because cancer is a disease of aging. Old people get cancer because nothing else kills them, which is correct. But that has been used as framing to say, but rates in younger people are rising, and we don't know what it is. Everyone lights your hair on fire. Ah, right. That's basically the take-home message of these stories. And so Andrea jumps in and she says, "Let's look at some very important details, some very important context that almost all of these stories leave out." And like I said, Liza can dive into the details here. One thing that stuck out to me most importantly is that when they say young people, what that actually means is anyone below the age of 50. Okay, now I'm 36. I'm youngish, I guess, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm not young. And someone who's 49 and a half, 49 and three quarters, as we used to say as kids, that's not young, right? I mean, that's just on the I guess the right side of the dividing line. And for technical medical reasons, you could describe that person as young, like in the context of oncology. Like, yeah, that's a relatively young person
Mhm.
because their risk is lower. But in the broad sense of how people use words like young, the implication that the average person's going to get is, oh, well, 17-year-olds are just getting lymphoma for like no reason. And
That's
that's really not happening.
that's really not happening. That's really not happening. It's what's interesting is me being 20 years older than you. I feel very, 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 very offended that I'm not considered young. so, so my risk is clearly much higher than yours. Well, not much higher, but higher than yours. But that's the way it goes. So first of all, out of the gate, cancer is a really scary diagnosis. It's a scary disease. Yes, you can see cancer in people as they tend to age. It's a disease of aging. Yes, some because of genetic things or other misfortunes. Some people who are younger get it, but it's not because of it's not because you're being exposed to little trace chemicals in your cereal or anything like that. And the discussion around it is designed to make people afraid, and often is then also geared towards trying to sell a product. That to detox or supplement or a variety of things, and I think it's really unfortunate that the population spends a lot of its time absolutely terrified of this. And then once again, also the news needs clicks in order to get attention, and so they often will put a sensational headline on there. The fact of the matter is, when some of the things that have contributed to this perception that cancer is increasing have to do with how and when we screen for cancer. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a shift in screening to lower the age of screening for breast cancer. This might have been a couple decades ago. And when you lower the age of screening for breast cancer, you are going to find the more people with breast cancer. So it appears like the incidence is increasing dramatically, but you are find the existence of the breast cancer was there before. You just weren't picking it up. And so the perception is that there's a really significant increase, but it's not. It's not a significant. It's not that significant. If there's a 1% increase in breast cancer, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny increase. When you look at all of the per 100,000 people who get it. So it's really it's a very small increase. It's not worth getting everybody upset about because it's not going to it's not changing the baseline. In fact, in diseases like lymphoma, you're actually seeing over the past 2 decades a flattening of lymphoma, the incidence of lymphoma, and a decrease in the mortality from lymphoma. You're seeing, with these diseases and the that you're actually getting better treatment. Screening actually prevents death. If you screen earlier, you catch it earlier, you wind up you decrease the mortality from it. So what you're seeing in screening does not equal an increase in mortality. It does equal that you're picking up the disease earlier.
All such important points. Another observation she makes that a lot of people overlook, and it's very easy to overlook because you're not trained to look at a data set and go, oh yeah, that's an important qualifier. There was a study recently where they compared the Boomer generation, Gen X, and Millennials.
Yep.
And that this is one of the foundations for this increase in cancer risk among younger people. But what Dr. Love points out in this story is that in the oldest group in the cohort, the Boomer generation, they're older, and so the chances are they've already contracted whatever cancers they're going to get because there's an age where the risk is greatest, and then if you get the cancer, whatever the outcome is, you've already contracted the disease. Now for the Gen X and the Millennials, they're getting older, but they're entering that age range where their risk is greatest. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you've actually detected, and this is similar to the point you just made, it's not that you detected an absolute and serious increase. It's just that you happen to be taking a snapshot at the time when these people are at the greatest risk.
Right. So yes, so if you are, you can slice and dice things a whole lot of different ways, and you can actually amplify inadvertently. Amplify what appears to be a risk when it's actually not. Because if you catch them right in the right part of the timeline, you will have a certain number of people who are younger, a certain number of people who are in the middle, and a certain number of people who are older. If you follow them as cohorts over time, it's probably going to all come out in the wash, as opposed to a slice of time, if that makes sense. Prospectively, if you followed them. Does that make sense?
I think so. So in other words, from my own understanding, just to make sure I've got this right, like if you take a snapshot, if it's sort of like a cross-sectional look at these different generations, that's going to give you a somewhat distorted picture. Whereas if you follow them for their
over
lifetimes,
time.
right. And I think that's what she's getting at. You would have to have studies that go, well, yeah, we know what you're detecting here because we've actually followed these people as they age.
As they've aged. And then you have to also account for the increases in technology that can pick up things more easily, right? So, back in the 60s, you didn't have mammography. And it wasn't until mammography was introduced that you wound up picking up a lot more cancer. And so it looked like cancer increased, exponentially, when in fact you were just picking up cancers that you hadn't been picking up before. And then you start treating them early, so the mortality goes down. If you see the mortality for breast cancer, it's really gone down over the decades. And so it's not looking at the whole kind of story around, the whole actual success story around treating cancer.
And then just to finish up here, a really important point that you've made ad nauseum at this point is that life expectancy and quality of life has increased substantially over the last century. So she points out, starting in 1900, life expectancy was below 50 on average. Today in the U.S., it's 73.5 years for men and 79.3 for women, and it's slightly higher for other developed countries like Canada, Australia, Japan. All of these countries, they're in the low 80s, like anywhere from 82 to 85 years old.
Yes.
And so, and you can talk to this too, but she says, the older you get, the less efficient your body works, including all of the mechanisms that control the cell cycle. And
Yep.
so mutations become more common, and over time, those can turn into cancers. And so you may not be seeing, like people like RFK and all, pick your favorite bullshitter. They'll say like, oh, it's this epidemic of poison in our food, and that's why cancers are increasing. In reality, it's just old people getting old. That's all
right.
it is.
That's right.
That's all it is.
That's exactly right.
Okay. We'll leave it there. Very good. By the way, I'll notice just as we wrap up here, none of the news outlets that ran these stories, they're not going to print a correction. They're not going to retract it. They won't say sorry. They've already moved on. These stories are still online. If you're fortunate enough to read the stuff that Andrea puts out or this podcast,
It's a great article. Yeah.
But most people are not, and again, the New York Times, all of these other outlets, they're going to turn around and they're going to go, now we're the fact checkers and we're here to separate the science from the misinformation, right? Round the circle goes. So little skepticism is always in order with these
That's right.
news outlets.